Hi everyone, I'm Gloria Tiller, and this is the local scene. We try to highlight favorite people and things going on in Kalamazoo. Tonight we have a really interesting show. It's going to be part history, it's going to be part current affairs, and things that are going on in Kalamazoo and things that you may be interested in participating in. So we have a historian with us tonight, and we have an entrepreneur with us tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my two guests tonight. We've got Keith Howard, who is the historian, and we have John Liberty with us, who is a favorite name around town that we've had dealings with in the past, and most of you will know him from his articles that he's written. So
many
moons ago, but you're still here. Keith, what brought you to Kalamazoo? Are you a native?
No, I grew up actually in Ionia, which is between Grand Rapids and Lansing, right? And came to Western. I'm one of those kids that came to Western and never left, right?
Ah, me too.
Yeah.
Oh, you too?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Me too.
Love Kalamazoo and yeah. So just
Okay.
love
Now,
being there.
did you go to school to become a librarian?
Hardly. My background, I started in engineering and ended up with degrees in accounting and information management. So go figure, right?
Okay.
And after a couple of decades in retail and I've landed at the Kalamazoo Public Library, and I love that place. It's very near and dear to my heart, and yeah, I manage the website content there. So.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into your other passion in just a minute. But John, what was your path?
Born and raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay.
And chose to come over to Kalamazoo to study broadcast communications and journalism at Western.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, so you utilized your degree.
For a minute. Yeah, no.
More than a minute.
Yeah, I had a whirlwind 9-week tour in Europe with my then girlfriend, now wife, and then came back to Kalamazoo. Was sleeping on my buddy's couch and trying to figure out a way to make ends meet. And one of my former bosses at the Gazette, when I was an intern and part-timer, said, we might have something for you if you'd consider any of these three options. And so I said, that one looks all right, let's try that one. And they said, we'll hire you. And then, so I was covering entertainment, so music, food, arts, culture in Kalamazoo for almost a decade before jumping and launching the West Michigan Beer Tours, which was
so we're going to be talking about, if you haven't figured this out, and you probably haven't yet, we're going to be talking about beer. Now we're talking about breweries in specific. And John, you have West Michigan Beer Tours, and that's the name of your company.
Correct. Yes.
Now it's more than just Kalamazoo.
Right. Well, yeah, West Michigan. So we were up in Grand Rapids pretty frequently, and Holland, Muskegon, and up and down the Lake Shore, and all the fun communities in between. Michigan now has over 330 breweries, and in our little coverage range, there's probably somewhere between 140 and 150. So.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And this is probably a pretty, I mean, this isn't a winery tour, this is a brewery tour. Now, breweries are becoming more popular, or?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Kalamazoo, we like to refer to as sort of the birthplace of Michigan's craft beer resurgence. So, yeah, there's
something that didn't start in Detroit?
Well, there was beer in Detroit. But yeah, I mean, we'll get into it in a little bit, but Prohibition had a pretty big effect on what was happening in terms of small batch, locally produced beer. And now we're at the point to where some of the smaller breweries are now very significant companies that employ many people and contribute millions, well, billions of dollars to the state economy now.
Sure.
So.
Well, yeah, economically, yeah, it's good for the economy.
Sure.
Now, from what I understand, though, you started researching. Now, first of all, I got to go back. Kalamazoo has a week that they call Beer Week. Now, we just
Right.
passed that. They do that in January.
Right.
And that's sort of where the breweries in Kalamazoo, how many currently?
16 with more on the way.
16. Oh, my
And
goodness.
some of those are multiple facilities under one. brewery.
Okay, okay.
But still,
But still, they all get together and they offer specials and entertainment and stuff.
pairings and, yeah.
Okay, okay, pairings?
Yeah, food and different beers.
Right.
So you can
Okay.
get like a 3 or 5 course meal with 3 to 5 different beers that
Ooh.
bring out the attributes in each. So.
Oh, wow.
So a few years ago, the library decided to start a series of programs that tied in with the current beer culture and literacy and the whole deal there. So we developed a series of programs, and the first year did them in the library itself, where people would come in and
Now,
listen.
and these are called, this program is called?
Yeah, it's now called Overdue Brew. So, yeah, Overdue Brew.
Like an overdue book?
Right. We began by calling it Booktoberfest, but
I remember that.
Right, but we switched from October to January, and it just kind of developed that way. So anyway, we call it Overdue Brew, and we developed a series of programs, and they did well the first time out, but the context wasn't quite right. I mean, coming into the library and talking about beer was one thing, but so the second year we kind of flipped it and took these library programs into the breweries and have experts and authors and come in and talk about these things. We do food pairings and things like that.
Now, do you do this during Beer Week, or you do this?
It follows Beer Week, and it's spread over about a month, so the end of January to the beginning of February.
So we're doing this show the second week in February, and you've still got a couple of programs.
Yeah, there are two or three
Two
programs coming
programs
up.
left.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, and you can check the Kalamazoo Public Library site, and there's a public media. Oh, there's Keith Howard, Kalamazoo Public Library, kpl.gov.
Right.
There you go.
Right.
So, and
go to the-
you're going to do these next year too?
Yeah, absolutely. This year, especially, I think the momentum has gone, and it's proved to be very successful. So all of our programs, in fact, we partnered with West Michigan Beer Tours and kicked this year's program off with a series of a couple of bus tours where we packed a couple of 55-seater buses with local beer lovers and went around town to where some of these old breweries were and the new ones and talked about it and all of that. And they sold out. They're free programs, but they sold out within a couple of minutes.
Well, so again, these are free tours. And
Well, as part of the
The library
yes.
program.
it was
Programs are
part of
free
the
programs.
part of the
Right.
program.
Yep.
And so you offered these tickets up, and 2 minutes later,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
they filled
we were
out.
gone.
And the other programs have filled up fairly quickly too. So it's been a really exciting series.
So these are reservation only kind of things.
Because they're in small groups.
Yeah, small groups.
Small
So-
spots and the
Okay.
brew pubs and things, so,
Yeah,
yeah.
something to consider.
Well, and the genesis of the whole tour that we did is sort of a mobile version of Keith's pretty incredible research project that he did, which when I was back working in the Kalamazoo Gazette and writing about beer, I came across his research project on the history of Kalamazoo breweries. And I was fascinated by it. I was unaware of all of it. And so I did what I guess we call aggregation back in the day. I don't know if there's
Right.
another name for it
So-
now, but basically take his work and repackage it and put it out on our platform. But it was such a robust and intriguing read as we kind of talked about programming. There was the idea of taking that research project with what I'm doing with introducing people to Kalamazoo beer and kind of meshing them together and put together a pretty dynamite program and kind of the two of us sort of bounced off each other, not like a comedy routine, but
So-
it was close. Right?
So how long have you been doing the brew tours?
This year was our fourth one.
No,
Yeah.
Oh, the one
no, how
together,
long
John.
have you been doing the West Michigan beer tours?
We launched in 2013.
Okay.
So we've been
Okay.
doing walking tours and bus tours and some bicycle
Oh,
tours.
so there's walking tours. So you
Every
go on.
Saturday.
Okay, so you're in January, Beer Week is in January, you're in early February, and
Right.
you are year round.
Right.
Okay, you just keep rolling.
Yeah,
And I would imagine that the summer's just as busy as any other
yeah,
time.
yeah. Summer gets spring and summer get pretty hectic.
Okay.
A lot of people are coming to Kalamazoo from all over the place to check out our beer culture.
Okay, so now you packaged this one tour that was a historic versus, and we're gonna get into that in just a second.
Yeah.
Now, in the summer, are you gonna implement any of the historic information into your tours?
Yeah, I've been using this, especially with myself and then our staff, to kind of give a context for what Kalamazoo beer was. Kalamazoo was kind of quirky, and then it went dry 5 years before Prohibition set in, which is
5 years before Prohibition?
Yep.
1915. So we get into some of that and explain, and there's a pretty interesting kind of coincidence that Michigan, after Prohibition, was very, very quiet in terms of small neighborhood breweries,
Okay.
small scale beer operations. So to have that big lag and then have Kalamazoo kind of be the first with Larry Bell and what is now Bell's Brewery Inc., kind of sort of restart the whole craft beer phenomenon back in Michigan is kind of a neat story to piece together with what.
Yeah,
we've done. So yes.
hold on to that hold on to that thought. I'm gonna come back to that because I wanna know what constitutes a craft beer versus a Budweiser kind of thing. But we're gonna get back into
Yeah.
that. What we're gonna do now is when John's been talking about your project,
Right.
okay, what in the world possessed you to decide that you were gonna research old, what?
Pure insanity. I'm an insanely curious person, and so my regular job is web content and managing the library stuff. But being in the middle of the library, I
Of
love the
course.
library resources and that kind of stuff. And I was actually working on another project and there was something I wanted to reference, possibility of a beer in Kalamazoo in the 1890s, so I figured I needed to know what I was talking about.
1890s.
Yeah,
okay.
and started looking at it and really found nothing more than a list of names and no context of what was where and all of that, and that just didn't satisfy. I needed to find out where these things were and all of that. So I started digging and ended up putting together through library resources and through Western Michigan University and through the museum, just all the local resources, pulling all this stuff together and kind of writing this story of where these things were and what they did as much as we possibly can.
You know, it's interesting because last week I had someone on who also did research, and I think I'm going to have to do a couple of shows on just how you research. Because this kind of research, you can't just Google this stuff.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't work.
Right.
It's not the end-all place that you get information. So Kalamazoo per se, not Bronson, but Kalamazoo per se was founded 1840-ish?
No, 1832-ish.
32-ish?
Yeah. So,
Okay. So when was our first brewery?
So by 1832 or so, there was really nothing here. There was just a field and a stream and maybe a couple of log huts. And within about 5 years, by 1837, we had upwards of 1,000 residents. We had mills and shops.
What brought people here?
The move west. The land was cheap. There was lots of resources.
What ethnic group was coming in first?
Initially, a lot of English, right? And that changed quickly, so you'll see that in a second. But within that first 5 years, we had all of these things going, and by the end of, by 1837, there was already one distillery in town and a brewery in town.
That quickly?
Yeah, that quickly. And now a couple of fun facts, if you want to look at this. The annual per capita consumption of alcohol in those days was 3 times what it is now.
Oh, my God.
So, we were not a dry nation. There was a report published that same year, actually, by the Kalamazoo Total Abstinence Temperance Society. You think Prohibition took place in the 20s or whatever. Actually, it had roots 100 years before
So
that.
these were Puritans that came.
Yeah, these were, there was a group that were pretty much anti-alcohol beginning then. So there were 5 local liquor retailers that year, 1837. Their total output, or the total consumption in town at that time, was 4,300 gallons of liquor, which included over 1,000 gallons of whiskey. Our population was 1,300 people.
Oh my!
So, and interestingly, by the 1860s, we had 6 breweries and 2 distilleries, plus a whole crop of saloons and all of that. And we were still only a population of about 7,000.
So these breweries were set up to make the beer.
Right.
And they sold that to the saloons? Or
They
could you walk in and buy a keg and carry it home?
Actually, both. Both.
Okay.
You could buy barrels at the local grocers, at the
Oh, my
dry
gosh.
goods stores. You could, later on, it was sold packaged, so bottles and things. You could go either directly to the brewer, or you could go through distributors. They had,
Yeah.
stores, grocery stores or whatever, or the saloons.
Okay, so we have a picture that Bill can put up on the location of the first brewery
Yeah,
in 1836.
Yeah, the location, it all kind of narrows down to a guy named Hall. John Hall, we know, lived in Kalamazoo by 1837. He actually established a brewery, which you're seeing on the screen here.
Now, if you look at this is actually looking south.
No,
looking
this is
north.
looking north.
This is looking north.
Yeah.
And if-
Today, that would be Waldo Stadium.
So if you're looking north, that's where West Michigan and Oakland come together at
Yep.
the north tip, and that is Waldo Stadium.
Yeah, that's where Waldo
location.
Stadium would be. About
Oh.
1842 or so, sorry, 1846, he was buying hops. We assume he was brewing at his home on Portage Street, but built this new large brewery on the west end of town. And that was, again, John Hall. So that was really the first one.
Wow.
And ran for about 8 years or so.
Now that looks like a big operation there.
It was. It's really hard because we don't have great pictures. We don't have any pictures,
yeah.
actually. This actually is what it looked like several decades later. So this is in the 1870s. This is a drawing
Okay.
from the 1870s. So
These hung around a bit. They were popular.
Yeah, right, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And so we kind of put this tour together and quite literally put people on a bus and we traveled around town and talked about where these things were and what used to be there. There really is nothing left of any of them. There are no buildings left now.
Are there any people that were connected with? I mean, when did all these breweries that were so popular? You said that they went out before Prohibition.
Well, by Prohibition, there was only one left. The last of the last of these small, you could actually call them craft brewers. They all went away by 1880. And so there was only one from the 1880s until 1915 when Prohibition took effect. So.
Now, I don't know which one of you can answer this, but was this sort of the pattern in the United States? I mean, you got Budweiser, okay, in St. Louis, and you've got Coors in Denver, and you've got the big beer places, but as a general rule around the country, around the U.S., you didn't have a lot of small breweries, did you? Like there were wineries?
Right. There's kind of an interesting story, if I could jump in with this. These small brewers all fell victim to the big ones. So we've got, by the 1870s and 1880s, we see the major brewers in Detroit and
Okay.
Milwaukee and Cleveland and those are in Chicago, and those are all competing and shipping their product in less expensively. Now, one thing we joked about when we were out on touring around, some of the Kalamazoo beer labels, and these would be from the 19-teens, Kalamazoo actually, to focus on its local product, started advertising, and this was a tagline on the bottom of the beer, on the label, said, made clear, anyway, without drugs or poison. So made pure without drugs or poison. So the idea was to imply that these national brewers, you don't know what's in it. But they literally opened the door of the brewery here. You could walk in. They invited people in through the news. Come in, take a look. Your neighbors are the ones that manufacture this stuff. Look at our facility. It's clean. We're making local beer. And that was their attempt to compete with these big boys that were, the big nationals that were selling things cheaper.
That was before Prohibition.
And that was before Prohibition.
Okay.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, on a national scale, there were well over 4,000 breweries in the United States prior to Prohibition, and up until early 2017 did the United States actually clear the number of breweries. So now there's well over 5,300 in the United States,
Wow.
but it took that long for what was a very robust brewing culture in the United States to kind of come back around. So it's
Right.
Yeah,
Interesting
yeah,
tale,
that's interesting, and now, I mean, I was in school I was in Kalamazoo in the 80s after school and stuff, and I don't remember the little breweries or anything. There wasn't anything
weren't
like
any.
that.
There wasn't
No.
95% of the beer then consumed was major label brands. So yeah.
So what came after Hill, Mr. Hill, over on Stadium?
Well, then there were actually only two that came about during, say, pre-Civil War time. But by the end of the Civil War, we were up to 6. The one on the west end of town that we just looked at was around. But if kind of working on this tour,
Yeah, there's a couple more.
yeah, the second one, this one, actually the colored building on the right-hand side is right about where the Gospel Mission is now.
Oh, sure, okay.
The
new
other
Gospel-
building is the original train station that was there at that time. But this, in the 1850s, there was a brewery there. Gentlemen named James Holmes and Jacob Harlan opened that about 1850. It only ran for about a decade. They ran a saloon and a brewery, and that operated. But those two were really the first two that came about. Okay. After that, then we could travel a little bit farther northward, and this was a gentleman named George Judge. He showed up in Kalamazoo about 1850, and he was a maltster, which means he was a malt maker, right?
Now, what's that?
And malt is when they take grain like barley and allow it to sprout, and so the sugars begin to come out, and then they roast it. And that's really the core ingredient of beer. It was also used for animal feed and other
Well,
things
what
like
was
that.
the core
then.
ingredient before?
Oh, that was it. That was that. Beer is essentially water and malt and hops and
Yeast.
Yeast.
right?
Hmm.
So
Okay.
yeah, so he was a malt maker, and he kind of did a little brewing on the side and made some dark ales that were supposed to be very, very good.
So what's ale?
Ale was really kind of one of the original ones, and I'm no chemist here, so forgive me for that. But ale brews at a higher temperature than what we would. Well, we'll talk about lager in a second, but it brews at a little higher temperature. It's a little less stable, but it was at that time cheaper to produce.
Well, there's cash for barley.
Cash
Oh, I
for barley.
love that.
Right, and that's George Judge's Malt House. That's an
Okay.
advertisement for that.
So he was buying barley.
Right. So yeah, ale produced with a strain of yeast that tended to be a top fermenting. It rose to the top as it fermented. And
You've got some other ads in here too that now these people, here's Boomersheim?
John Bommersheim. He
Bommersheim.
was a local bottler. At that time, Goebbels was a major brewer in Detroit, and Bommersheim was the local bottler. He was also George Judge's son-in-law. And so he was a major, and interestingly, Judge was this maltster. He produced a lot of the malt for the Goebbels Brewery in Detroit. So we see a major brewery in Detroit sourcing stuff locally out of Kalamazoo.
So what's lager?
Lager.
What's it mean, bottled lager?
Bottled lager. Lagering came with the German immigrants about 1850. So we see this wave of English people of English descent, and by 1850 we see a wave of German immigrants coming in.
And they bring their lager?
And one of their things was lagering. Lager brews with a different type of yeast that actually brews at lower temperatures, or takes lower temperatures to produce, and sinks to the bottom, but it produces a more stable beverage, or at least it did in those days. And lager is what became known as American beer.
Brewers of ale and lager.
Ale and lager.
And this
right.
is...
That's Vogel and Bowman. They were the brewery on the west side that we looked at first went through several changes of ownership. So.
Highest market price in cash.
Right.
So these are ads asking for barley and hops.
Right. These are all from our local newspapers. So.
Okay, now, were we growing barley and hops around here?
Farmers were growing. Yeah, absolutely.
We still growing hops around here?
Yep.
Really?
Yep. Kalamazoo and lower southwest Michigan actually has some significant hop farms, as well as the Traverse City area. Same places where you see vineyards doing really well. You'll see a lot of hop farms. So Hophead Farms in Hickory Corners, just past the Gilmore Car Museum.
Yeah.
There's a 30-acre hop farm up there. That was one of the first and one of the major groundbreaking hop farms in Michigan.
So hops and barley and obviously yeast and water. So you could call our local breweries pretty much pure Michigan.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, if technically.
There are a lot of some of the Yakima Valley in the Pacific Northwest is where is the North American headquarters for hops. So a significant amount, a vast majority of the hops used by breweries, both in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and the rest of the country for that matter, comes from there. But there is a relatively new movement to purchase Michigan hops and use them in some beer as well. And the same goes for malt.
Okay, so the ingredients in wine, the grapes, all deliver different flavors based on the grapes. I'm guessing that maybe that's true with the different flavors of hops and barley, or is it the scientific way that it's put together that changes the flavor?
Well,
Yes.
both, but right, yeah. There are other grains used also. It's not exclusively barley. So brew with rice or brew with wheat, different things like that. And those in and of itself take on different flavor characteristics.
Sure, I would imagine.
Also, the amount of roasting that's done of the malt. So lightly roasted will produce a lighter flavored, really dark roasted malt, and by roasting it releases the sugars and caramelizes it. So we have that's where we have those caramel notes that come through in the beverage. So
Okay.
So yeah, there are all sorts of blends there. And what's hilarious, some of these first things, of course, a lot of brewing was done at home then. That was one of the housewife's main duties, in addition to washing and cleaning and taking care of the kids, was to brew the beer, right? And right.
Okay.
And so there were all sorts of recipes that were done, anywhere from just plain sugar and water and yeast to green pea shells and all kinds of other things to flavor it and do things like that. So.
Okay, so wine varies from different alcohol levels, okay, 17, 18, I'm not sure. Whiskey obviously is way up there. Wine is sort of in the middle, and then beer has always been considered the lowest alcohol level, so people can drink more of it, or they can limit their intake or whatever. Is that are we brewing today in the new breweries the same alcohol level or the same types of beer that were brewed in the 1840s? I mean, well, we can't go back and say this was the alcohol level in these beers, but has it changed?
It's changed a lot, but remarkably, we're dealing with just basic product here, and a lot of it is very similar, especially with some of the ales, the brown ales and things are very, at least from what I've read, are very typical of some English style ales that were done, and the German ones that came later, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we were beerless pretty much through the 30s, and then the big breweries took over in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and no one was interested in making beer anymore. It kind of got out of their system. So then,
Well, it wasn't, I'll let John talk about this part, but it wasn't so much that beer was out of the system, it was just such a large system. These major manufacturers,
Right.
I mean, it was like trying to start a car company and immediately competing with Chrysler or Ford. They just couldn't do it.
No,
the
because-
individual couldn't do it. And in America at that time, it was much like coffee, where they talk about Starbucks really changed our appetite for coffee, or changed our what taste,
palate.
our
Our
palate for
palate,
coffee, right?
yeah.
Craft beer did the same thing.
well, see, beer was beer. I mean, I never could perceive any flavor difference per se, and there probably wasn't much.
There wasn't much, right?
Beer was a
Until
beer.
these craft brewers came along, and then they changed things fundamentally, so.
So there is a
Or
distinct
brought
flavor.
it back.
Or brought it back,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but, so we now, we're gonna go back to the rest of the historic stuff in a minute.
Sure.
But we now have, how many breweries in town?
Kalamazoo County has 16. That's taking into account both Bell's facilities, the Eccentric Cafe, which is
Okay.
the original brewery, and then the Comstock Brewery.
Okay, yeah, the big one.
Yeah, which continues to grow and expand.
Yeah.
So there's those two still fall within that, excuse me, 16. But there's a number of other breweries
Well,
in the
you've
county in the
got,
works
now
right
is
too.
Latitude 42, that is a brewery as
Correct.
well as,
And they're opening a second location
Oh,
on the west
cool.
side of town here next month.
and Arcadia came from Battle Creek and came
Correct.
over. So what is a craft beer?
Well, it's kind of a moving target these days. There's been the definition has kind of fluctuated over the last few years, but basically the Brewers Association, which is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, is sort of the voice of U.S. craft beer. So they
Okay.
also have the definition for what is a craft brewery. And there's without getting too much into the weeds on some of it, there is a annual production cap. And then there's an ownership percentage that will determine whether or not you're still considered a craft brewery. So once you make more than 6 million barrels a year, you are no longer considered
6
craft.
million
And that number has
barrels.
moved over the
Yeah,
years.
I bet, yeah.
And so there's that aspect of it. And then no more than 30% of the brewery can be owned by a non-craft brewery entity.
Okay,
And there are some other elements too, but those are the two big ones. So to answer the question, you can still be a craft brewery
And brew a ton of beer.
and brew a ton of beer,
Yeah,
but you
yeah.
can also brew less
So-
than 6 million barrels of beer a year
okay.
and not be
So,
considered
so
craft.
basically a craft beer simply is the type of facility. It doesn't mean that it's a particular type of beer.
Right, no, it's,
Okay,
yeah.
so you've got these craft brewers. Do they specialize in an ale or a lager or well, whatever?
Predominantly ales, but in the last couple of years, there've been kind of a neat movement of breweries, either specific breweries just specializing almost solely in that style of beer, as well as breweries that have historically just produced ales or mostly ales that are starting to pursue pilsners and lagers a little more. So now,
Ooh, Pilsner,
yeah,
what's that?
similar to
Okay.
to a lager, different originates from a different part of Germany, but so that's going to be a big thing to watch, especially in 2018 for craft beer fans. Bell's is going to start rolling out its lager in cans, which should be significant. Founders just announced they're releasing their lager in
Founders?
cans. Founders Brewing Company in Grand Rapids, and then Parent Brewing Company, which is a little north of Founders, also just started rolling out a lager. So I think this will be a big year for craft lagers and pilsners. So the beer world's kind of split into two. There's the lagers and pilsners, which Keith talked about, and then the ales. So ales includes porters, stouts, IPAs, India Pale Ale, pale ales, and a whole assortment of others.
Oh my goodness.
Well, you'll appreciate this. We like to talk about craft beer being a choose-your-own-adventure book in liquid form. So there's all
Oh
these
my
different
God.
avenues you can go into, and all these little twists you can do on, say, something as simple as a stout. Not as simple as a stout, but a standard stout can have blueberries added to it.
That, well,
Or
see,
you
I
can
was just
barrel age it.
just
So
going to get
there's-
into that because I had heard people talk about that you've got flavoring, just like coffees have become hazelnut and cherry and all this kind of thing. So now you have beers
Yep.
that have all these different flavors in them too.
Yep, One Well Brewing here in town. They have
Which one?
Jalapa, One Well Brewing.
One Well Brewing.
They're one of the rising superstars in Kalamazoo beer, but they have for example, they have Jalapa, which is a blonde ale brewed with jalapenos. You can actually get a
Oh.
fresh jalapeno served in it, so it can give you a little spicy kick if you'd like that. And then they go on the complete opposite side and do a coffee donut imperial porter.
Coffee?
Yeah.
That sounds...
Sweet Water Street. So I always mess this up. Water Street Coffee Joint and Sweetwater's Donuts, and then they combined it together. So 3 Kalamazoo entities getting together in a beverage form.
Not everybody's cup of tea, as it were, for sure, but
Right.
hey, if you're
But-
adventurous,
If you're
run with it.
choose your own
Right.
adventure.
Yep, see,
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So do these places have, I mean, you walk in and you're walking into their brewery,
Right.
basically, and you can see the beer being made, or, now, I know that wines are seasonal. Are beers seasonal too, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the big one that I remember is Oberon.
Oberon, yep.
Oberon, and somebody said that is seasonal.
Correct.
Now, what makes it seasonal?
Well, for Michigan folks, it's only available in the spring, or the spring and summer, in the warmer months. Although there are other parts of the United States where it's available year-round, but that's generally because they're warmer all the time. But the idea is that the tastes and profiles of these individual beers sort of lend themselves or match with what's happening in the season. So right now we're in the kind of cold, darker months. So you're seeing a lot of big stouts right now. This is when a lot of the breweries roll out their big barrel-aged beers. So those will have high alcohol by volume. A lot of
And they
porters,
they
too,
take
will be
longer to
popular.
make too. They have to be in the barrel longer.
The barrel-aged beers, because what they're doing is they're taking a beer and then placing it in bourbon or whiskey barrels. And then those will sit for months as the beer kind of takes in all the goodness from
Woo!
the barrels. And then that changes the entire profile all around.
Now, not all of these breweries do that.
No.
Certain ones specialize in certain things.
Right.
So you have to sort of tour around until you find your favorite kind of thing.
You jump on West Michigan Beer Tours, and there you go.
And you
Put
go
that
you
on
go
the
the whole west coast of Michigan?
Yep, Saugatuck,
All the way up to
St. Joe,
Traverse?
Benton Harbor. We don't do as much in Traverse, although we've got a couple things in
Okay.
the future that we're looking at. So
Well, the way
mostly day trips.
I would now, this is not just unique to Kalamazoo, that we went from 0 to 16 breweries in what,
Right.
5 years or 10 years, something like that.
Well, starting in '85 with Bell's. so-
Okay, so, but even so, I think 2 years ago, we only had 6 or something like that. I mean, these last few years have really taken off. But Kalamazoo's not unique in this. This is happening across the country.
Yeah, in the state. Yeah, Michigan is now ranked 6th in the nation in terms of total breweries, and it's
Okay.
an almost impossible number to grab. It's fluid, if you will,
Yeah,
but
well-
because there are breweries.
That was a pun, right?
offering, yeah, a bad one. We need a rim shot in here, but yeah, there's exciting beer cities all over the state. Traverse City, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Detroit, Ann Arbor have some pretty exciting scenes going, and the Upper Peninsula has a fun
Well,
industry development
Upper
there, too.
Peninsula
Marquette
has a
great beer
market.
town. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, I remember, well, even around here, I remember getting directions, I think, out to a restaurant, it was kind of in the boonies, and they said, well, you go down M40 until you get to the bar and you turn right. And then you go until you get to the bar and you turn left. And then you go a little bit further, and when you get to the bar, you turn right again. And it was, they didn't mean it facetiously at all. It just happened to be the landmark that told you how to get to someplace rather than the street name. And I think what you were saying in the beginning of 1850, there were more saloons in town per capita, and perhaps that, is just, the way the American people
Right.
have defined themselves.
It was interesting. One side note was as Prohibition came about, the sort of the roots of it grew. A lot of the roots of Prohibition weren't in total abstinence. In other words, no alcohol whatsoever. There was a strong move against hard liquor, so against rum and against whiskey. That clearly there was a problem there. So the brewers kind of marketed themselves around that.
As pure, no
Right,
poison.
and as actually as a healthy beverage. So they tried to market it to families. So you would go home and go to the store and pick up your 6-pack or whatever and consume it with your family. It was a healthy beverage. They equated it with liquid bread. That's one kind
Oh
of
my
number
goodness,
that keeps.
because they use yeast and barley.
Right,
in it.
exactly. Similar ingredients. So that was one piece of it.
But too, to be fair, with some wells and things around town, I would imagine that the quality of water wasn't necessarily, especially in the early
Right.
1800s and that period of time when everybody was digging wells, there was no, basic system.
Right.
So, especially out west and stuff, I mean, some places didn't have water. And so beer was sort of the drink that sustained you,
Right.
so I would think. What other breweries have we got in the historic stuff, if we go back to the historic ones a little bit?
So if we kind of turn our bus around from the north side and head down to Walnut Street.
Okay.
And
Do we have any pictures for Walnut Street?
no, unfortunately there aren't. But Walnut Street down just east of John Street, which in today's age would be right. Pretty much exactly where Bronson Hospital's emergency room is,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
In the mid-1850s, what the Gazette called a German political refugee by the name of Count Lorenz Brentano found himself in Kalamazoo and set up a brewery right there. That was another one called the Kalamazoo Brewery. He ran it for a couple of years. And ended up in Chicago. He was quite a political figure, I guess, and ended up in Chicago. Another guy, it went through a few changes of hands. A guy named Peter Herbolzheimer took over. They were doing about 150 barrels a year, or about 4,700 gallons, something like that. So a pretty small operation. By 1862, during the Civil War, a gentleman by the name of Barney
Well, that
Lockard.
goes back, yeah. Go back to, or keep going through some of the ads that we've got there. Yeah,
Yeah, there we go.
There we
That's
go.
right.
That's the
That was
Hall.
Hall and Russell. That was the one on Burdick Street that we talked about earlier, so.
Okay.
But this gentleman by the name of Barney Locker showed up in Kalamazoo, and by 1862, he was brewing what he called good hay and harvest ale and beer at $9 a barrel. And he ran in town for quite a while. Actually, by 1865, or toward the end of the Civil War, he was the second largest operation in town.
Oh,
And,
really?
Yep, he ran it into the 1870s. 1874, he added on, but kind of set upon hard times and ended up in default of a mortgage and went out of business. So it was sold and liquidated in 1879. Interestingly, the building survived until 1968 as an apartment house or as a tenant house.
Really?
And was torn down when Bronson expanded. Bronson Hospital expanded.
I can't
Yeah.
remember that one.
So probably not, but it was in the newspaper.
Well, now, how many breweries were around in 1920?
By 1920, well, national prohibition took place in 1920. Kalamazoo went dry 5 years earlier, so 1915, and we had just one brewery in town by then.
Okay.
And that was the one out on Lake Street. Now, there were a couple of others. There was one, there used to be a street just south of Lovell Street called Winstead. It's a parking lot now, but there was another brewery in there that was, it was called the Portage Brewery. That operated for a few years during the 1860s and then ended up closing up.
What was taking the place? What was taking the place of these breweries for people that wanted to frequent saloons and drink their beer? Were these coming? These were actually what was driving them out. Really, was the competition in Detroit and Chicago.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Because at that point you've got train service, right?
Right.
See, 1860 or 1850, you've got these trains that are going right through the middle of Kalamazoo.
And fundamentally, what would happen is the saloon keepers, which there were a host of saloons, each saloon keeper would set up an alliance with one of the major brewers to be the exclusive.
Oh.
And so national beer brands or major brewers in the big cities would bring their product in and sell much cheaper. So, you know.
Was it a better quality, you think, than some of the crafts that were the early crafts?
By then, lager was the popular beer, and we're talking right after the turn of the 20th century there. So lagering was the most popular. So by then, it was really down to that one style and what you could get cheaper, you know.
Okay.
So.
What were some of the names? You guys remember the names of some of those beers? Was Schlitz?
Oh,
Was
the
it-
national brands,
Yeah.
you mean? Yeah, Schlitz, Budweiser, Pabst. Pabst was very big.
So Budweiser was around at that point too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Stroh's was pretty
Stroh's was a
Stroh's.
huge
significant
one.
out of Detroit Port.
And
Coast.
Miller, how?
Miller was around,
Yeah.
yeah. And
So-
all of these began as essentially small brewing operations and then just expanded. And,
Blue. Okay.
yeah, so.
Do we have the potential here, you think, with some of these craft brewers? I mean, Bell's has become pretty national.
Yeah, it's the 7th largest.
Oh, here's some of
Craft-
the
craft
pictures
brewery.
from your tours.
Yeah,
And,
that's Brian from Boatyard Brewing Company. They refer to themselves as the Happy Brewery, so naturally he is smiling.
Boatyard is on Patterson,
Correct.
right near the river up there, just before you get to Riverview.
Yeah.
Where's that?
This is Gonzo's Big Dog Brewing Company, the old.
That's off right next to
West
Academy.
Off Westnage and.
West
No,
Newton?
that's Rupert's. I think is the one you may be thinking of.
Oh, okay.
Off Academy there. This is Gonzo's right there
Okay.
at Westnage.
Behind the
Car dealership is
Oldsmobile
slipping
dealer.
my mind. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the production space. So when we take our tour groups through, we hang out with Gonzo, one of the partners and head brewer there. We have some samples. He tells us his story, and then the other side of that, those fermentation tanks and bright tanks and things, where the general public gathers. Actually, technically, there's the kitchen, and then there's
Yeah,
the
okay.
tap room where everybody generally goes to hang out.
Okay,
It's our chance to kind of get a sort of sneak peek at what goes on.
sure.
This is
It's like Arcadia.
yeah, Arcadia's
Arcadia Brewery.
patio. Yep.
Now, Arcadia chose to come over here from Battle Creek, so they've got production.
Well, originally the plan was to open in Kalamazoo. Tim Surprise, who still lives here in town, intended to open his brewery in what was, or what is, the Kalamazoo Beer Exchange building.
Oh,
And
yeah.
at the time, the city thought that this is the early 90s, 92, 93, 94, somewhere in that area, thought that there was enough beer in town with Bell's there, and then Old Peninsula followed shortly behind in 96 as a brew pub. So Tim Surprise ended up taking his operation to Battle Creek, opened downtown Battle Creek, and operated there for several years until the space no longer allowed them to produce the amount of beer they needed to. They were basically capped at around 10,000 barrels. So he came back to Kalamazoo to
Kalamazoo.
see if the city was interested in bringing more beer on. And at
And
that
they
point,
were.
yeah. And at that point,
Who knew?
yeah, well, starting in October 2013 is when you saw 3 breweries open in consecutive months downtown. So up until then,
Wow.
there was just Bell's and Central Cafe and Old Peninsula Brew Pub. And then October 2013 had Rupert's, Gonzo's, and then Tibbs joined in those 3 months. And then Boatyard followed a little after. Arcadia came on, Bright Eyes.
Bright Eyes.
And now,
Where's
Final
Bright
Gravity.
Eyes?
Right by Vandersholm's,
Yeah.
just on Burdick. By
Off
the,
Crosstown.
Oh,
Crosstown,
okay,
by the
crosstown,
police
yep,
station
yep,
there.
across from the police station there, yeah, okay.
And they do breakfast.
And they do breakfast? Oh, how cool, Bright
coffee,
Eyes.
yeah.
Coffee, beer,
Yeah.
breakfast, man, you
Or just
can't
coffee,
get better
breakfast,
than
then
that.
come back later for
I
breakfast.
don't know, there's a chance to do beer at breakfast, some people do.
I've heard of it happening.
It's no different than champagne at breakfast, who knows? But, so things have evolved. I remember a time that Coors wouldn't cross the Mississippi. Now, and I don't know if that was their policy or if it was a national policy, that the guys from the East Coast didn't want the West Coast competing with them.
I think there were distribution laws, and John, you probably know more about that than I do. There
I
were,
don't, actually.
yeah, there were
I'm not sure
tangles
when
with, there were certain regions where maybe Coors, I know, had, it was the Mississippi, so west of the Mississippi, they had, but they couldn't market east of the Mississippi maybe for a certain reason, because somebody else had the exclusive there or something.
But
so.
you were telling a story that when you were in school,
You're right, yeah. My 21st birthday, I worked in a restaurant that had their meat commissary in Denver. And yeah, my 21st birthday I spent in the blizzard, the big blizzard of '78. And the truck driver brought me a case of Coors that night from Denver, and
you were
and
trapped
so
at the restaurant?
No. I was at
You were-
home, but with my roommates. But yeah, it was.
Oh, so
It was fun. It was
So you had
well
Coors.
supplied, and that was a really cool thing. Now it's
Yeah.
a big deal. You can buy Coors, you can buy anything anywhere. But in those days, that was
That was-
exclusive. That was
I
a big
remember
deal.
that.
Although that same kind of thing is happening with craft beer now, especially for breweries that are, notable breweries that are outside of Michigan that don't distribute here. When beer fans travel to different locations, or
Right.
vice versa, when beer fans come to Michigan.
They'll stock up.
On our tours, we've had a number of Canadian friends who will join us, and a lot of Michigan beer, strangely, isn't distributed there. And so they will find the good bottle shops or go to the breweries, and they will stock up. They will quite literally fill their trunk with
We have-
Michigan beer.
Yeah,
because
we have family in Florida, and up until a couple of years ago, you couldn't find Bell's down there,
Yeah.
and now you can, but not the really unique stuff usually. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they have Oberon and things like that. But
Oh, yeah. So, oh my gosh. It's fascinating to see the coming back of this. I mean, the fact that we didn't even know about this stuff in the 1800s, but now it's the resurgence of the breweries. And you've had wineries for years. I mean, wineries, and the problem with those is that they have to be near the place where they grow the grapes generally. I mean, that's where you find wineries, and we happen to be along that particular parallel on Earth that, allows wineries. But beer can be grown or can be made anywhere, because you can import your hops. So, and the other thing my cousin is doing cider.
Oh, right.
And what do they call them, cideries?
Yep.
The cideries are starting to pop up too.
We have one here, Texas Corners Brewing Company. It's owned by the Schultz family. And the Fruit Ridge Farm in Mattawan grows a lot of the apples that they use in their hard cider. So they have a dry cider, a cherry cider, which is their top seller.
Now, the
and a
Fruit Ridge Farm in Mattawan is owned by,
the Schultz family, and they also own Texas Corners Brewing Company.
Okay.
Texas Corners, so they.
see, the Fruit Ridge band of growers is just north of Alpine, off of Fruit Ridge Avenue, where I grew up on an apple orchard. And that was the Fruit Ridge that I'm familiar with. So, and I think there's a connection between the Schultz family in Mattawan and the Fruit Ridge growers.
It's interesting how those all tie in with that sort of thing. What happened in these early brewers, then it sort of rolled over. We went through this period of non-things, and then now a lot of the trends we see now, just like what you're just talking about, happened then. One that was that kind of attests to that was the Birchnall family. This was a family brewing outfit that was out on Lover's Lane, kind of across from Millam Park. And in the 1870s, set up a brewery in his barn, Joe and Mary Birchnall. And it became quite an operation. Actually, they grew to be the second largest in the community at one point in time. And apparently their beer was excellent. But interestingly, it was, they brewed also root beer. And her ginger ale, I guess, was quite a specialty. Mary was as much involved with the operation as he was. And if that name kind of might sound familiar, they had, Joe and Mary Birchnall had a daughter, one daughter, and their daughter married, Joe and Dorothy Birchnall had a daughter named Mary, forgive me. And Mary Birchnall married a guy named Westnidge, right?
Oh my God.
And they had a son whose name was named after his grandfather, Joe Westnidge. And so our Colonel Joe, our famous World War I hero, his grandparents were some of the town's biggest brewers.
And that's
so,
fabulous.
Yeah,
that's
so.
fabulous. Yeah, but now.
Liquid Courage, right?
Liquid Courage. But see, you found all that out in between your research into these breweries. And so, did you read newspaper articles? Did you?
Oddly enough, most of this stuff is all trapped in newspaper articles. So.
Trapped in newspaper.
Well, I call it trapped because they're not. You referred to Google earlier, the stuff that you can't just necessarily Google.
No.
And in some of it's available online, some of it's not, but a lot of times you just need to do some real digging. I've been working on a history of the Oakwood Amusement Park now for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm lazy or anything. It's obviously I have to work it around all my other projects, but it's just so time consuming to go dig through that.
And Keith has been nice enough to do that Oakwood presentation a couple of times out at our bookstore, Kazoo Books. And we do need to make a plea here that sometimes people find in their family treasures photographs, pictures, or letters, drawings, diaries that pertain to some of this, and we're going to be doing a show. I have to put a plug in. We'll be doing an entire show on the amusement park, but you need photographs, and even more photographs on the breweries, or if you are, you know, a distant relative and may know something.
Right. Interesting. The one brewery we didn't really get to yet or talk about was the one on Lake Street, which later, the building later became Kalamazoo Creamery. But that
Oh
was
my
established in the 1870s, and that actually ran through until